Nobody in the room made a sound. Not the nurse who had been working since 5 in the morning. Not the secretary who had followed the Pope through 3 corridors without fully understanding where they were going or why. Not the elderly woman seated in the chair by the window who had not received a visitor in 11 days. The silence was total and specific, the kind that descends when a room full of people simultaneously understands that they are witnessing something they will carry for the rest of their lives. The Pope was not composed. His white cassock was creased from hours of walking. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, the kind of voice a person uses when they are no longer managing how they sound, but simply saying what is true. And what he said in that moment, in that plain cold room with its unlit overhead bulb and its untouched breakfast tray, spread across 20 countries before the day was done. This is the story of what he found, and what he refused to look away from. It began not with a formal directive or an administrative review. It began with a letter. By the time Pope Leo XIV had been in the chair of Peter for less than a year, the Vatican had grown accustomed to a certain quality of surprise. He was not a predictable man. He had grown up in Chicago and grown old in Peru, and somewhere in the decades between he had developed the kind of unsentimental clarity about suffering that belongs to people who have sat with it long enough to stop flinching. In less than 10 months he had dissolved comfortable arrangements, appointed inconvenient people to inconvenient positions, and issued a directive requiring that no Vatican office spend more on its own renovation in a year than it distributed in charitable aid. The old institutional structures had absorbed these pressures with varying degrees of grace. The press had watched with undisguised appetite, and the people at the edges of the church, the poor, the sick, the ones who had been waiting for someone to use the word accountability and mean it, had allowed themselves the cautious beginning of something that resembled hope. None of that, however, had prepared anyone for the morning of March 1st. It began the way his most consequential decisions tended to begin. Without announcement, without any coordination beyond a single request to his personal secretary, Father Esteban Vidal, a quiet man from Trujillo, who had served him since his years in Peru, and who had learned over a long partnership that when the Pope asked for a car at an unusual hour, the request did not come with an explanation attached, and the correct response was simply to arrange one. The car was requested for 6 in the morning. No destination was announced in the official schedule, because no destination had been logged in the official schedule. Father Vidal knew where they were going, because he had placed a handwritten letter on the Pope's desk 3 weeks earlier, and had watched what happened to the Pope's face while he read it. The letter had arrived in the 3rd week of February, buried inside a stack of correspondence that the papal household staff sorted daily. It was handwritten in careful Italian, the penmanship of someone who had once been taught that how you formed your letters reflected how seriously you took the person receiving them. It was from a woman named Sister Bettina Ferrara, a Franciscan nun, 86 years old, who had given 63 years of her life to the Church, and was now, for the past 3 years, a resident of a Vatican-administered care facility for elderly clergy called Via della Grazia. Located on a quiet road about 20 minutes from St. Peter's Square, she had not written to file a complaint. She had written because, as she explained in the first sentence with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone with no time left for preamble, she was afraid that if she did not tell the truth to someone who still had the authority to act on it, the truth would simply expire with her, and nothing would change. She wrote about heating that had not worked reliably in the East residential wing since autumn, about meals that arrived at 3:30 in the afternoon, lukewarm and reduced in portion, not from any malice but from a kitchen budget that had not been adjusted in 7 years, and a staff that was doing the arithmetic of impossibility with genuine effort and genuine inadequacy. She wrote about the nurses, good people, clearly good people, stretched so thin across so many residents that their care was perfunctory not from indifference, but from the pure mathematics of being one human body asked to do the work of 3. She wrote about a priest she called Father Anselmo, 90 years old, former missionary, 40 years in East Africa building schools and burying parishioners and celebrating Mass in languages he had learnt in his 60s because that was what the work required. He sat every morning in the corridor outside his room in his wheelchair, dressed in his clerical collar, rosary in his hands, waiting for a Mass that was now celebrated only twice a week, because there was no one available to celebrate it more often. He waited anyway. He dressed for it anyway. He waited the way people wait who have spent their entire lives showing up for things that matter whether or not anyone else showed up with them. She wrote at the end, and this was the sentence the Pope had marked with a pencil line in the margin on his third reading: Holy Father, they are not asking to be celebrated. They are asking not to be forgotten. And I am no longer certain that the Church understands the difference. Father Vidal had found the letter at midnight. He had placed it on the desk the following morning, with no introduction because it needed none. Leo had read it over breakfast. He had not spoken for a considerable time afterward. He had read it again. Then a third time. On the third reading he made the pencil mark. Then he set it down and did not discuss it with anyone. 3 weeks passed. He said nothing public. He made no announcement. He filed no directive. To his staff he appeared entirely occupied with the ordinary pressures of the pontificate, the diplomatic correspondence, the synodal process, the ongoing negotiation with the dicasteries whose structural rearrangement he was quietly continuing. The letter seemed, from the outside, to have been absorbed into the ordinary volume of his correspondence. It had not been absorbed. It had been waiting. On the morning of March 1st, the car pulled out of the Vatican grounds at 6:15 in a Rome that was still half dark and cold, with the particular cold of a city that has not yet decided to admit it is spring. The streets near the Vatican were nearly empty. A delivery truck, a street sweeper, a pair of carabinieri who came to attention automatically as the vehicle passed. Via della Grazia appeared at the end of its road as the light was beginning to strengthen, a long pale building surrounded by a garden that had clearly been beautiful in a warmer season and was currently managing to look only functional. The iron gate at the entrance was unlocked, but no one was manning it. Father Vidal pressed the intercom button. There was no response for nearly 90 seconds. Then the gate buzzed open. They walked into the entrance hall unannounced. It was clean. Institutions managed by conscientious people under inadequate resources are often clean, because cleanliness is achievable on very little money if the people doing it care about dignity. The floors were old and well maintained. There was a small statue of the Virgin near the entrance with an unlit candle in the holder beneath it. The candle had burned down completely and not been replaced. Leo looked at it for a moment. He said nothing. A young woman appeared from a side corridor, stopped when she saw the white cassock, and went immediately the specific color of someone who has just understood that they are in a situation for which their training did not prepare them. She was perhaps 26, in a nurse's uniform, and she had the eyes of someone who had already been working for several hours. Her name was Giulia. She had been at Via della Grazia for 16 months. She was currently one of 3 nurses responsible for the morning care of 58 residents. 3 nurses, the Pope repeated quietly. For 58 residents. Yes, she said, sometimes 2, when someone is ill. He did not editorialize. He said, "Walk with us, please," and began moving down the corridor. What he found in the next 2 hours was not dramatic in the visible sense. There were no obvious scenes of crisis. There was no single image of clear neglect that could be photographed and captioned. What there was, and what was in some ways harder to witness because it was so ordinary, was the accumulated residue of a system that had allowed the distance between its reports and its reality to grow so wide that the people living inside that reality had stopped expecting the gap to be noticed. In one room, an elderly priest sat in a chair facing a window that looked into a courtyard where nothing was growing yet. He was dressed. He was clean. He was entirely alone and had been, Giulia confirmed in a quiet voice, since a family visit 3 weeks earlier. In another room, a woman in her 90s lay with a rosary on her pillow and her lips moving, and the particular expression of someone conducting an interior life that had long since ceased to require the participation of anyone else. In a third room the door was open, and a breakfast tray sat untouched on a side table, and the priest in the bed was asleep past 7, which Giulia explained was because the night staff had been reduced by illness, and sometimes things did not get done in the sequence they were supposed to get done. Leo stopped at the door of that room. He looked at the tray. He looked at the man. He asked his name. "Father Anselmo," Giulia said. He was in Africa for decades, Leo said. It was not a question. Yes, Holy Father. She paused. He doesn't always know where he is now, but he wakes up asking for Mass. Leo moved into the room quietly. He put his hand on the old priest's shoulder with the specific lightness of someone who has learned to touch the very old the way you would handle something irreplaceable. Father Anselmo opened his eyes with the gradual effort of a man surfacing from somewhere far down. He looked up at the white figure above him with the mild, unfocused quality of someone who has not yet assembled the present moment into complete sense. "Good morning," Leo said. Father Anselmo blinked. Then his expression shifted, not into recognition of who this was specifically, but into something more fundamental and more moving than recognition. He understood that he was being looked at directly, that the person standing above him had arrived for him specifically, and not as a task on a list. His face changed with it in the way that faces change when they receive something they had quietly stopped anticipating. "Good morning," he said. His voice was thin as paper. "Are you the new chaplain?" "No," Leo said. "I am just visiting." "Good," Father Anselmo said. He settled back slightly. "Visitors are good. We don't have enough of them." Leo stayed a few minutes. He made sure there was water within reach. He spoke a few words. Then he stepped back into the corridor, and Father Vidal, watching from the doorway, noted something in the Pope's expression that he recognized from 10 years of close proximity, the particular set of a face that has finished its internal deliberating and has arrived somewhere on the other side of it. They found Sister Bettina on the second floor. She was in the common room, with her prayer book open on the table, seated with 2 other elderly women in the quiet that communities of the very old develop. A companionable silence built over years of shared proximity. She was smaller than the formality of her letter had suggested. White hair, bright eyes, hands folded with a precision that spoke of decades of structured prayer. She looked up when they entered, and looked at the white cassock for several long seconds in the manner of someone determining whether what they are seeing is actually occurring. Then she pressed her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled. Leo walked to her table and sat down across from her. Not beside her, not standing over her. Directly across, at the same level, like 2 people who have agreed to speak plainly. "Your letter reached me," he said. She opened her eyes. They were wet but steady. "I was not entirely certain it would," she said. "It reached me." He met her gaze. "Will you show me this place?" She would. She did. With her cane and a directness that age had refined rather than diminished, she walked him through the sections of the building that the official reports had accurately described, and the sections that the official reports had made comfortable rather than true. She showed him the chapel, which was maintained with evident care, fresh flowers, polished candlesticks, a genuine sanctuary. She showed him the east wing corridor where the radiators along the wall had not been functioning since the previous November, and where the residents slept in additional layers because the extra blankets had been requested 3 months ago and had not yet been allocated. "November to March," Leo said. He turned to Father Vidal. "Write that." He visited the kitchen. The cook, a man named Giacomo who had spent 11 years preparing meals for the residents with a combination of genuine affection and genuine frustration, laid out the financial arithmetic without being asked, because he had been waiting for someone to ask for long enough that when the opportunity arrived he was not going to waste it. The per-meal budget had not been revised upward in 6 years. In 6 years the cost of the food had risen considerably. The quality of what he could provide had decreased proportionally. He was not apologizing for this. He was reporting it as a fact that had produced a reality that he personally found unacceptable and had no individual power to change. Leo listened to all of it. He did not take notes himself. He did not make promises out loud. He did not perform the kind of reassuring commentary that officials use to signal sympathy without incurring obligation. He simply absorbed what he was being told with the full attention of someone who intends to act on it. He spent 3 hours in Villa della Grazia that morning. He sat with residents who had been missionaries in Bolivia and Korea and the Philippines. He listened to a 92-year-old nun describe teaching children to read in a village in Mozambique in the 1970s. In a school that she and 2 other sisters had built themselves from materials donated by the surrounding community over a period of 3 years. because there was no government program and no institutional funding, and no one was coming to do it for them. He held the hand of a priest who no longer spoke in full sentences, but who gripped his hand with surprising strength, and looked at him with eyes that still held the particular quality of someone who has, over a very long life, seen both the worst and the best of what human beings can produce. He thought, sitting with these people, about what it means to spend your life in service of something, and then to arrive at the end of that life in a cold room, waiting for a meal that will arrive late and lukewarm. He thought about what it means for an institution to keep meticulous records of its own benevolence, while the people those records describe are sitting in corridors, waiting for a mass that happens twice a week when it used to happen every day. When he left, he thanked Julia. He shook her hand and looked at her directly, and said that what she was doing in that building mattered more than she had been told, and that the failure was not hers. She wept. She had not expected to be thanked. She had expected, at most, for the visit to result in a memo that would be processed through the appropriate channels over the appropriate timeline. 3 calls were made from the papal apartment by noon. The first was to the cardinal heading the relevant dicastery, a man with 30 years of institutional experience who had navigated the Vatican's administrative currents long enough to recognize, from the first sentence of the conversation, that this was not a call he could redirect through his office. Leo told him what he had found: the broken heating since November, the staffing mathematics, the uneaten breakfast tray beside Father Anselmo's bed. He told him that a full operational and financial audit of every Vatican-administered elderly care facility was required within 30 days, that in the immediate term, heating would be restored within the week, staffing would be supplemented, and the meal budget would be revised. The cardinal began to explain the ordinary process by which such matters were typically reviewed. Leo interrupted him without raising his voice. "I am not asking how these things are ordinarily handled," he said. "I am telling you what will happen." A pause. "Of course, Holy Father." The second call requested 5 years of budget comparisons, Vatican expenditure on elderly care facilities set against Vatican expenditure on administrative offices and diocesan structures in the same period. He asked that the figures be delivered in writing. He used the word written twice. He wanted the numbers on paper where they could not be qualified away in a verbal presentation. The third call was to his communications staff. He wanted to record a statement, not a formal address, not a prepared text drafted by committee and softened through rounds of institutional review. A direct statement. He said he did not want it edited for tone. He said he would record it the following afternoon. He recorded it sitting in a plain chair in a small room off the Apostolic Library. No staging. No flags. No architecture of authority. A chair, a camera, and 16 minutes during which he said what he had seen, and what he believed it meant, and what he intended to do about it. He began with Scripture, Leviticus, the commandment to rise in the presence of the aged. He said it was not a metaphor. He said the Church had built 2,000 years of hospitals and schools and orphanages, and that this was right and good and holy. And then he said that somewhere in the administrative history of those 2,000 years, the Church had developed a tendency to confuse the maintenance of its structures with the care of its people. That a well-kept chapel and a broken heater in the room beside it were not the same thing. That a filed budget report and an untouched meal tray were not interchangeable. That the form filed about a person and the face of that person had been allowed, gradually, almost imperceptibly, to drift apart. He spoke for several minutes with the measured precision of someone who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and intends to say exactly that, and nothing cushioned in its place. And then he stopped. He looked at the camera. He said, "I sat yesterday morning with a man who spent 40 years in East Africa. He built schools. He baptized children. He buried the dead. He learned languages in his 60s because the people he was serving spoke those languages, and he believed that was the minimum he owed them. He is 90 years old. He sits every morning in the corridor outside his room in his clerical collar with his rosary in his hands, waiting for a mass that can only be celebrated twice a week because there is no one available to celebrate it more often. He waits anyway. He gets dressed for it anyway." He stopped again. This time the pause was longer. His expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with honesty. When I walked into his room, he said, his voice had become something different, quieter and more direct than public speech. He looked up at me, and he asked if I was the new chaplain. He pressed his fingers briefly to his mouth. His eyes were full. He asked me if I was the new chaplain, he said again, and his voice had the quality of a man no longer performing anything at all. And I thought, this man gave everything. He gave his youth and his health and his years and the full force of his intelligence and his faith. He gave all of it. And we cannot keep his room warm. He stayed with it. He did not move past it quickly. He stayed in that sentence the way you stay in something that is true and that costs something to say true. When he continued, his voice was steady again, not because the feeling had passed, but because he had let it be what it was without redirecting it. He said that the church's elderly were not a logistical category. They were its memory. They were the ones who had carried it through the periods when carrying it was physically and spiritually difficult. He said that when an institution fails to carry in return those who carried it, it has failed at the most basic thing it was asked to do. He said that every diocese, every religious congregation, every Catholic institution operating care facilities for its elderly should walk those facilities this week. Not review the reports. Walk the corridors. Sit with the residents. Ask the nurses how many people they were responsible for. Find out when the heating had last been repaired and when the last Mass had been celebrated. And if the answers produce discomfort, stay with the discomfort. Let it produce action rather than a memo filed about action. He ended by speaking directly to the people living in those facilities, not as a demographic addressed by institutional policy, but as individuals addressed by name in the only way available to him without knowing their names. He said, I see you. Not as a category, not as a line in an allocation report. I see you, and I ask your forgiveness for every moment that the Church allowed you to feel that you were not being seen. By the following morning, the statement had been viewed millions of times. Headlines appeared in languages across every continent where the Church maintained a presence. A columnist in Rome, who had not written warmly about the Vatican in years, published a piece about what it sounds like when someone in authority is telling the truth rather than managing a narrative. A journalist in Chicago, the Pope's home city, wrote 4 words. He means every word. Giulia learned about the statement when a colleague showed it to her on a phone in the corridor outside the East Wing. She watched it in silence. When it ended, she stood very still for a moment and then went back to work, which was the only response available to her, and the one that honored what the statement was actually about. Sister Bettina watched it in the common room on a tablet brought to her by one of the younger staff. She watched all 16 minutes without moving. Afterward, she sat with her hands folded on the table in the precise way she sat when she was not praying, but was doing something adjacent to it. After a long silence, she said to the young woman beside her, he kept the part about Father Anselmo exactly as it was. He didn't soften it. And how do you know when someone means what they say? The young woman asked. Sister Bettina looked at her. When they keep the part that costs something, she said. When they don't change it to something easier. Father Anselmo was told about the visit later that day, in the careful and patient way that very old people are told things when you want to make sure the telling lands properly. He listened to the account. He asked some questions. He nodded. Then he said, with the unhurried certainty of a man whose sense of proportion had been refined by 9 decades of paying close attention to what actually matters, I thought he was the new chaplain. But he stayed and listened. A man who stays and listens is good company. That is not a small thing. He picked up his rosary from the table beside him. The heating in the East Wing was restored within 36 hours of the Pope's visit. That evening, dinner arrived hot, at a reasonable hour, in portions that reflected a budget revision that had moved faster through the administrative process than any budget revision in the facility's recent memory. Outside Father Anselmo's window, the late afternoon light had turned the particular gold that Rome produces in early March, when the sky can't quite decide whether winter is finished. The light came through the glass and lay across the floor of his room in a long, pale rectangle. He sat in his chair in his clerical collar with his rosary and watched it move slowly as the sun declined. He had waited that morning for Mass. It had been celebrated. The new arrangement, one of the immediate interim measures, had ensured a priest was available. He had dressed for it. He had gone. He had come back to his room, and the room was warm and the light was good, and he was not alone in the way he had been alone. Because somewhere in the previous 48 hours, the building around him had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the specific direction of being inhabited by people who were once again aware that he was in it. That is a small thing only if you have never been without it. Subscribe. Share this with someone who has given their life to others. Leave a comment below. These stories exist because you choose to keep them alive.